So I'm not very up to date on most things. And so when someone wrote me up and asked me to do an ASMR video, I said that I had no idea what an ASMR video was. And then I went down this internet rabbit hole and found that ASMR videos are videos of people crinkling, crunching. I'm still not 100% sure that I got it, but give the people what they want. So I'm going to present to you my sugar ASMR video. I've got the good recorder on, so let's see what we can do. I've got this local honey from Amherst, Mass. This is a good place to start. Tastes like honey. Guess the sound wasn't very good on that one, so try this little peppermint. It's a lot of sugar. Alright, I've got some Smarties candy. Don't think I've had Smarties in around 30 years. Good crinkle on these guys, too. Does anyone like Smarties? No one likes Smarties. Here's a bit o' honey. Really going for the retro candy vibe here. Nope, this is completely inedible. Could be a year old, could be 40 years old, no idea. I'm not finishing this bit of honey. This Vanini chocolate looks pretty good from Italy. It's with lemon and red pepper, very Italian. Better crack than crunch, I think. Oh no, this one's gonna be good. This is gonna be really good. You're gonna really like this. Alright, Apple. Got this kiwi fruit cut in half. Actually, I didn't know you could eat a kiwi fruit with a spoon until this year. No good sound from kiwis. No good sound. Disappointment. And I guess here's our grand finale. This is white, refined cane sugar. Pure cane sugar, if that means anything. I think this is really going to be something. Oh, listen to this. Very satisfying. I don't know how long it's been since you've had a spoonful of raw sugar. I don't think I'm going to recommend that to anyone over the age of 5. Well, I think I've done my first ASMR video. I don't really understand what it's about, but I do know that I feel deeply sick after eating that much sugar. Something I do know a lot about, however, is the history of where the sugar comes from. Stay tuned. Hey everyone, I'm Benjamin Siegel, and welcome back to Taste, Culture, and Power. Think back for a second to the last really sweet thing that you had. The odds are you don't have to go back really far. Sweetness is one of the defining tastes of our life, and sugar is at the core of that sweetness. It's a crystallized source of pleasure that we've built relationships with throughout our entire life and throughout all of human history. To eat something sweet is to tap into a source of fundamental pleasure, and whether you have a sweet tooth or not, all human beings have some kind of innate love for sweetness. We pick out the sugars in our mother's milk, and then we just go from there. We find more and more ways to enjoy that substance that gives us the energy to fuel life. Maybe the last time you had something sweet, it was a piece of fruit or a dash of honey. But in the modern world, it's probably more likely that you had some kind of refined sugar, made from sugar cane or sugar beet. And that sugar was probably cheap. You had it in a pastry, in a drink, or in a bar of candy. Sugar has gone, in the last 1,000 years, from being something prohibitively expensive and unthinkable luxury to something that you can enjoy every day, and it's accessible to basically everyone on planet Earth. And whether you take your sugar in simple ways, as a really clear crystalline candy or mixed together with chocolate, or in fancy confections or pastries, you're the beneficiary of that transformation. Think about the diversity of sugar that you consume. As cooks and eaters, we know that sugar is fundamentally versatile. Sweetness is one of our basic tastes, and we can use sugar to fill out or balance or deepen other flavors that are a little more subtle. A really great example of that is chocolate. Chocolate, of course, is made of cacao, which is a South American tree seed that's ground down and then cooked into a paste. By itself, it has some really intense and complicated flavors. They're a little confusing to our palate. There's hundreds of different molecules, everything's slightly fermented, so it's one of the most complex things that we can actually get on our tongues. But when you take cocoa and add sugar to it, it opens it up. There's a basic sweetness, and that lets us perceive a richness that isn't quite as accessible in the raw product. So we use sugar to balance or fill out flavors. It can also disrupt the coagulation of proteins, so we can use it in pastries to tenderize a gluten network and to do the same thing with egg-based custards or creams. You heat up sugar just a little bit and break open its molecules, it turns into different shades of golden brown. And its flavors also get more complex. You get new acidity, bitterness, more aroma. You can also use sugar to sculpt things. You can heat it and use its moisture to get everything from a chewy candy to a brittle hard sheet. Obviously, there's a ton that we can say that's really good about sugar, but today we're going to dive into its uglier history. Sugar was responsible for massive destruction in Africa and the Americas, and it fueled the rise of slavery to satisfy a growing European demand for sugar. And while we're not going to talk about it as much today, sugar has also taken the place of more nutritious foods in many diets, and it's given us a wide range of diseases from diabetes to obesity that were virtually unheard of in pre-modern times. I'm not going to try to steer anyone away from sugar, it's one of life's basic pleasures. But today I want to contextualize its role in our modern diet. So long before human beings had access to refined sugar, we had access to sweet things and sugars in fruits and honey. We know that some fruits can be incredibly sweet. Think about a date whose sugar content can reach at least 60%. And you can take a fruit that's not even that sweet and make it sweeter by drying it out. Dried fruits are a much quicker source of sugar than their fresh counterparts. But the prize of the pre-modern world in terms of sweetness, of course, was honey, which is around 80% sugar. Humans have collected honey for at least 10,000 years. We've got cave paintings like these in the Spider Cave of Valencia, Spain, that show the collection of wild honey. By around 4,000 years ago, if we believe Egyptian hieroglyphics that show clay hives, then we were domesticating bees to use their honey directly. Honey was the source of tremendous pleasure in antiquity. Lots of early poems from the cradle of civilization describe lovers as being like honey. And in the Bible, many verses speak about the pleasures of honey, and they also associate that taste with romantic love. In Greece and Rome, honey was a prestige food that was often used in religious ceremonies. It was a way of linking the sweetness of heaven and earth. But it took a pretty long time for humans to actually understand how honey production worked. Humans eventually came to understand just what exactly the bee and the flower were doing when they made honey. Bees were taking nectar from the plant and separating out the water from the sugar. That was the model for human sugar production as well, and eventually it became clear that we could do this with different plants to make use of their natural sugars. Humans first did this with palm trees in Asia, with maple and birch trees in northern Europe and North America, and then with agave and maize in Central and South America. But of course, the most important plant in the human production of sugar would be the sugar cane. We all know what table sugar looks like. There's white crystals that you can pour or scoop really easily. That kind of substance didn't really appear on European tables until around 1100 of the Common Era, and for the next 600 years it was seen as an extremely expensive luxury, often thought of as a medicine. To understand where that came from, we've got to go to New Guinea, all the way across the world in the South Pacific. That was the birthplace of Saccharum officinarum, an extremely tall 20-foot plant with around 15% sugar in its stalks. Humans carried this plant with them as they moved across Asia, and around 500 before the Common Era, Indian cooks learned how to press the juice out of that plant and then to cook it down into a syrup of melted crystals. That product is still used in Indian cooking today, and we know it as either gur or jaggery. But in this period, the word used was shakara, and that's the source of the contemporary word sugar, which came through Persian. Around 150 years after that, we have records of Indian cooks who mix that substance with things like wheat, barley, and rice flours, and they often liven them up with sesame seeds. Sometimes they eat them directly, other times they fry that mix, and they look a great deal like Indian mithai or sweets do today. But they weren't just sources of pleasure. Indian physicians made a lot of use of sugar in different ways, and it was those doctors who identified, a few centuries after the creation of Indian sweets, ways to wash these crystals to get rid of their dark outsides, and that was the birth of refined white sugar. White sugar spread quickly. By the 6th century of the Common Era, that technology had moved to the Middle East. Persians had used a lot of sugar in their recipes, and when Arabs conquered Persia, a century after, they brought sugarcane with them to places like Africa, Syria, Spain, and Sicily. And so it was really in the Arab world that sweets were turned into a modern art. Arab cooks used sugar and they mixed it with almonds to make marzipan. They combined it with sesame seeds to make halva and boiled it down with rose petals and orange blossoms to create new syrups. And it was also the Arabs who learned how to create sugar sculptures. But sugar wasn't done moving. Europeans going to Palestine in the 11th century for the Crusades were taken with it. It began moving through the Arab world to Europe through Venice, and by 1319 it had reached England. We've got to back up here for a second and talk about what was going on in Europe in the same period. Europe in the early medieval period had grown crazy for spices. Many recipes in this period called for amounts of spice that we would consider way too much by present standards. Europeans were obsessed with cloves and nutmegs and mace, and all of those things were growing on just a small number of islands north of Australia. They were also excited about pepper, cinnamon, turmeric, cardamom, and ginger, which were being grown in Malaysia and to a lesser extent in South India. All of those spices headed to Europe via Italian and Catalan merchants, as well as through Portuguese trade. Historians have a lot of debates about why the European public was so crazy about spices in that period. Most likely it was a revival of earlier classical tastes made a little bit more extreme by access to new crops, or maybe the influence of the Muslim world at a moment of new connections. But whatever the reason, when sugar arrived in Europe, it was treated to some degree like any other spice. It was a flavoring, but also a medicine, and it was used in amounts only as large as people could afford. For nearly everyone, that wasn't very much. You might taste sugar in a preserved fruit or flour, or in small medicines. It was around this period that we first hear of confections, which were small preparations made by pharmacists used to balance the composition of the body. Often, sweetness was helping to disguise the tastes of other medicines, a lot like children's medicine today. People thought that sugar helped medicines release more gradually, and that they'd provide heat and moisture that would help with digestion. We make use of this logic today with things like lozenges or cough drops, where the same principle's basically at work. But Europeans were also getting excited about the purely pleasurable properties of sugar. It was probably a French pharmacist who made the first non-medical confection of sugar around 1200, coating almonds with sugar. And medieval cooks in France and England started to call for sugar in recipes for fowl, fish, and ham, as well as in fruit and cream-based desserts. By the 15th century, Europeans had come to think of sugar basically as a source of pleasure, and they were sourcing that sugar from places like Sicily, Crete, India, and the Middle East through long-distance trade. At first, European confectionery was pretty simple. There were things like pine nuts, hazelnuts, and almonds coated in sugar. Those were the earliest candies. But by the 15th and the 16th century, Europeans had learned how to spin sugar into threads, to make hard sugar candies in big decorations, and how to adjust the moisture to get sticky or chewy textures as well. Now, sugar was flowing into Europe in this period, but it was largely controlled by different groups of merchants. Italians from Venice and Geneva controlled most of the Mediterranean, and they were responsible for the movement of sugar from Beirut, Alexandria, and Tripoli to ports in Italy, France, and England. There were also land-based networks, and they connected Europe back to the Middle East in really interesting ways. Sicilian, Egyptian, and Cypriot sugar flowed from Europe to Arabia. But by the 16th century, the Mediterranean sugar world began to collapse. And some of this had to do with other factors. There was war in Europe and the Middle East, there were outbreaks of bubonic plague, and changing trade policies. But what was really fueling that trade was the movement of sugar west across the Atlantic Ocean. By 1433, the Portuguese were beginning to cultivate sugar on the island of Madeira, and soon afterwards on the islands of Sao Tome and Principe. Soon after that, the Spanish started to introduce sugar production in the Canary Islands, and they began to make use of the enslaved people they had purchased in Africa and a new model called the plantation to grow sugar in new quantities. The plantation was in many ways the precursor of the modern factory. It took labor, in this case enslaved labor, and it divided it into heavily regimented parts. The first movers in the plantation were the field laborers. They planted the crop and then they replanted it every 2 years. They'd weed it, harvest it, and then move it to the mill. And at the mill, iron rollers were turned by wind, water, or oxen. Then slaves would feed the sugar cane through the rollers, usually 3 at a time. The cane juice would dribble into a pan, and then they were sent by a pipe to the boiling house. In the boiling house, slaves moved the juice from one pan into another, and they'd clarify the sugar with blood, lime juice, or lye. Finally, as the sugar crystallized, they'd strain it, and they'd put it in clay jars to cure into brown sugar. The darkest sugar that settled at the bottom of those clay jars, which they called sugar loaves, was used to make rum, while the whitest crystals at the top were reserved for expensive European markets. The plantation model quickly moved across the Spanish and Portuguese world. It first took hold in the Western Hemisphere and the islands of Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. And then it moved to Brazil, which briefly took over as the world's sugar capital. But the Caribbean soon rebounded. The Dutch planters who left Brazil after the full takeover of the Portuguese brought new sugarcane cultivation and processing knowledge to islands like Jamaica and Saint Domingue, which later would be known as Haiti. And as sugarcane expanded across the Caribbean and the New World, the depth and depravity of the slave trade worsened. By 1700, more than 10,000 Africans were being traded to the New World each year via the island of Sao Tome alone. The sugar industry, of course, wasn't the only industry that was enslaving Africans. But most historians argue that sugar was the pioneer that helped bring slavery and the plantation system into the worlds of other crops like cotton and tobacco. And of the 20 million Africans who were brought as slaves to the Americas, probably around 2/3 worked in sugar. We talk about this period as the Atlantic slave trade, though economic historians often call it the triangle trade as well. Slaves were kidnapped and sold from Africa and brought to the Caribbean. The Caribbean produced sugar and rum as well as tobacco and cotton and then exported it back to Europe. And Europe used the exports of things like finished textiles and manufactured goods to finance the import of more slaves. This was a horrific and expansive system, and the human costs were immense. But it was also in this period when sugar consumption became deeply entrenched in Western Europe. The price of sugar fell dramatically in this period, in large part because there were very low or close to non-existent labor costs. Sugar was no longer a luxury good, but something that people across classes could afford. There were major health consequences here. European teeth rotted. But maybe more importantly for us as historians, there were all sorts of new sugary products that began to pop up in this period. Things like treacle and molasses and rum and all sorts of sugary syrups. Cookbooks exploded with whole new dessert recipes, and maybe even the whole category of prepared dessert does date from this period. And then the world of crafts and arts exploded with things like sugar tongs, sifters, spoons, and bowls. There's a big debate that economic historians have about the rise of sugar. Was it Europeans' rising desire for sugar that caused it to pursue new technologies and new forms of labor organization, from slavery to the plantation? Or was it new technologies and new forms of labor organization that caused Europeans to consume more sugar? That second theory is sometimes described by economists as a contrived demand. And it's kind of a chicken and egg debate, but it's a really important one. It's true that humans biologically crave sweetness like other animals. But we know that people can be induced to crave it even more through media, food science, and other technologies. Most likely, both things were occurring at the same time and mutually reinforcing one another. We'll come back to some of these questions a little bit later about why we want the things that we want. The era of big sugar would change forever in the 19th century. The biggest change was the decline of slavery. There were abolitionist movements and slave revolts, and throughout the 19th century, European countries outlawed slavery in their colonies. The enslaved Africans on the plantations were replaced, most times by what was described as coolie labor, or the shipment of Indian indentured servants to sugar islands. But productivity was beginning to decline in these plantations. Even if these margins were small, they were still more expensive than outright slavery. But the biggest blow to sugarcane in the Caribbean was something entirely unexpected. In the middle of the 18th century, German plant scientists learned how to extract and refine sucrose from the sugar beet. This was something of a novelty at first. But when the British blocked continental Europe during the Napoleonic Wars, these powers lost access to their Caribbean colonies across the Atlantic, and Napoleon himself offered inducements to develop a domestic sugar industry in France. Throughout the 19th century, beet sugar grew more and more important, taking off in Austria, Hungary, and Russia in particular. It was really easy to fit sugar beets into traditional European agriculture without relying on a plantation. You could use its leaves and roots as cattle feed and then just put the crop into regular rotation. By the end of the 19th century, beets were the source of more than half the world's refined sugar. The story of sugar, of course, doesn't stop here. And to get a sense of sugar as it changed course in the 19th and early 20th centuries, I reached out to one of the world's leading historians of sugar and capitalism. David Singerman is a historian at the University of Virginia, where he teaches courses on science, technology, the environment, and American capitalism. He's the author of the forthcoming book, Purity and Power in the American Sugar Empire, 1860 to 1940, and he gained some notoriety in 2016 for his New York Times editorial entitled The Shady History of Big Sugar. I reached out to Dr. Singerman to talk all things sugar.
I'm David Singerman. I'm an assistant professor of history and American studies at the University of Virginia, and I'm writing a book about the invention of modern sugar called The Purity Machine. What I like about sugar is that it lets me study the other things that I care about, like labor and empire and corruption and American history, the history of science, the history of technology. A long time ago, I was interested in studying like measurement and standards in a kind of history of science way. And I had a summer internship at the National Institute for Standards and Technology outside of DC in their museum and their archive. And I got there and they said, you should start off by reading the like original annual reports from the National Bureau of Standards when it was created in 1900 or 1899. They were like at this period in the history of science, they were talking about like really fundamental things like how long is the meter and like how long is the second and how heavy is the kilogram, pretty basic units you need. And yet in these not long annual reports about the work of this still relatively small Bureau of Standards, there was a huge amount about the purity of sugar. And I was like, what is going on? And they kept saying, we've invented a new instrument for measuring the purity of sugar and we've been perfecting the optics of this thing. And so I started pulling on this thread in the way that historians do and discovered that actually how pure was sugar was an incredibly important question to the US government at the turn of the 20th century, because this was before the income tax and most of the federal government's revenue came from tariffs on imports and like stunningly high percentage, like 20 or sometimes more than that percent of that tariff revenue was just from sugar. So actually there were like millions or tens of millions of dollars at stake in like exactly how pure is this sugar thing. In the 21st century, right, we have one way of thinking about sugar, which is that it's sucrose. Sidney Mintz says this. Every book about sugar says this. Sucrose is a molecule that has some carbon atoms, some hydrogen atoms, some oxygen atoms in it in a certain configuration. And pure sugar is 100% pure sucrose. And so one way of thinking about like the production of sugar and the consumption of sugar historically is that it's about increasing the purity of sucrose, right? People want pure and purer sucrose. They want whiter and whiter sugar. And the goal of the whole kind of plantation empire, sugar production, plantation complex is to take a plant, right? Whether it's a cane plant or a beet plant, and extract this molecule from it in purified form. And then once you've extracted it, you can put it into whatever you want. You can put it into Coca-Cola, you can put it into chocolate bars, you can put it into your cupcakes at home. Something that I'm interested in my research and my writing is what people thought about before they thought about sucrose. This idea of molecules and atoms and chemical composition, we now think of it as like the kind of basic building blocks of the world. But nobody thought of it that way before the 19th century. So if you go back before that, you find people talking about pure sugar and whiter sugar and better sugar and higher quality sugar and the character of sugar and all of these things. And whatever they meant by that, they didn't mean sucrose. They didn't mean molecules because they didn't conceive of the world in that way. So one of the questions that I'm interested in as a researcher and a historian and a writer is uncovering what it was like to eat sugar and buy it and sell it and make it before everybody saw the world in this kind of cold chemical way. If you go to the store today and you buy some sugar to bake a cake, or you're sitting down in a coffee shop and you pull out a packet to pour into your coffee, there's a number of places that it could have come from. It might have come from somewhere in the kind of tropical regions of the world, in which case it would have begun its life in a sugar cane plant. Sugar cane is a plant that has specific kind of climatological needs and temperate needs, and you can grow it from like Louisiana and Texas to like northern Australia, right, in that kind of zone. So it might have come from there. But if it does, it will probably say pure cane sugar on it. Consumers in the global north seem to really like this tropical thing. And so there'll be a picture of a palm tree on it, or like a beach, maybe like a kind of snowy volcanic peak on it. People don't, except people in a kind of history of food course, don't like to think about slavery and plantations and unpleasant origins of these global commodity chains. But the tropics have always had a certain kind of appeal. Another place that your sugar might have come from is from much colder, more temperate regions of the planet. Prime tourist destinations like Russia or Eastern Europe or North Dakota or Utah, which is where sugar beets are grown. The sugar beet is an invention of modern German chemistry. It's basically Frankenstein. It was given life in a laboratory in the early 19th century as this mongrel hybrid product. In the middle of the 18th century, when a German chemist announces that he's discovered a process for extracting sugar from a plant that isn't the sugarcane, it's quite a controversial claim because by definition, sugar is the thing that comes out of the sugarcane. It's in the title of his article. Like, I have developed a process for extracting a true and real sugar from plants that grow in our countries. So this is quite a radical claim to say that you can extract the same thing. And he has all of this microscopic evidence and other forms of early modern chemical analysis say, no, guys, it's really the same thing. And then his successors persuade statesmen and governments that this is an important discovery. We can now claim sugar independence from the colonies. And there's this weird language of these colonies have been lording it over us for so long. We've been shackled to our colonial possessions. We need to liberate ourselves from these plantations. But even though these governments believe it and they want to start factories to produce beet sugar, nobody else believes it. And people laugh at this claim. There's mockery and sarcasm and political cartoons about it. There's a political cartoon from 1810 in France that shows Napoleon trying to squeeze a beet into his coffee. And this kind of like sad little drops are coming out of it. And he looks really miserable. And his infant son is in this like cradle and is trying to suck on a beet. And the kind of grumpy looking nurse to the son says, "Your father says it's sugar. What am I supposed to do?" I published an op-ed in the New York Times in September of 2016. Earlier that week, there had been a large national news story about some revelations of what the American sugar industry had been up to in the 1950s and 60s. And it turns out that they'd been doing the same thing as the tobacco industry had been doing. They had a product that they recognized had potentially harmful health effects. So basically, they got these like public health researchers and doctors at Harvard and other universities to come out with studies saying that actually sugar consumption had no adverse health effects. The real culprit was saturated fat. So it was kind of like the sugar industry versus the beef industry for a long time. Evidence of these purchase studies had been uncovered by a researcher at the University of California who actually was working in a group that studied the tobacco industry. So the parallels were really clear in multiple ways. And so I published this op-ed that talked about ways in which the sugar industry in the United States had tried to manipulate or shape scientific knowledge. The best way to educate yourself as a eater of sugar and a consumer of food in 2021 is to make a resolution for 1 month that you're not going to eat any added sugar, and stick to that resolution for a month. You don't have to stick to it for the rest of your life. But if you promise yourself that you won't buy any products that don't have added sugar, it forces you, for one thing, to look at ingredient labels, and you will find sugar in all sorts of places that you didn't expect. I'm sitting in my office. There's a vending machine 2 floors down where I would often get like a midday snack. And I thought, oh, okay, rolled gold pretzels. How bad can they be? Turns out there's added sugar in rolled gold pretzels. I couldn't have that. You can't have ketchup. There's all sorts of weird stuff. And it will just make you more aware of what you were eating. When I did that for a month, I went from having a small cup of ice cream for dessert every night to having 3 grapefruits and 2 apples every night, because that's how much sugar my body was craving. And I would just look at this mound of fruit and say, my God, there's so much sugar in that half cup of ice cream. So that's my advice is make a resolution for 1 month that you're not going to eat any added sugar and see how it goes for you. Stick with it. It's harder than you think.
It's clear to us the ways that sugar in the 21st century is bound up with all sorts of bad things. Shortened lifespans, obesity, and probably a lot of other diseases as well. Sugar has made its way into just about everything we eat, and corporations have figured out how to harness our innate biological desires for sugar and to get us to eat more and more of it. But sugar was also a little bit rotten from the start, at least from the perspective of global capitalism and human welfare. Its expansion into Europe came at a time when European diets were really rapidly changing, and it fueled the rise of horrible exploitation and human destruction in Africa and the Americas. It also found its way into European diets in new ways, and one of those ways were the new pleasures of coffee and tea, which probably wouldn't have taken off without a little bit of sugar to make them go down easier. We're going to get to that next time, but for now, let's leave it here. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you all very soon.